right, everybody, we are going to go through the 8 watercolor technique kind of practice before we move on to talking about our first larger summative painting project for our course. We'll do one other kind of day of technique and practice building before we get into our larger painting project. What you'll see is that I have my half sheet of watercolor paper. I divided this already using a ruler and my micron pen. You guys all got 2 of these within your own kit. Use this if you have it on hand because the ink will not bleed once we start using our watercolors on top of it. You'll need some brushes. I have 2 here. I have a round and a flat brush. You can just work with one brush the entire time if you would like to. It's kind of personal preference. I have my watercolor palette open and ready to go. My palette looks a little bit different because I am working from home right now. However, you guys have this exact same kind of colors, palette, and everything like that. It's just a different setup. I have a little tiny dish of water. Have some paper towel on hand just because you're gonna wanna dry your brush off every once in a while. Within 2 of our boxes here, you're going to use 2 other materials that you'll probably have on hand at home or in your kitchen. The first is saran wrap or just kind of plastic wrap. If you don't have plastic wrap at home, you could use like a plastic bag, like a Target bag or a sandwich bag. Find something with kind of that plasticky, moldable texture to it, and that'll work great. And then I have some just like regular salt, just regular table salt. And I'll show you how we're going to use those in just a moment. So, very first box, I don't really care where you start. I'm just gonna start in my upper left-hand corner with the way I'm facing it. You're going to choose a brush, whatever you want to work with. You can use a round brush or your flat brush. Flat brushes typically cover a little bit more space, so if you're trying to work a little quicker, that's okay. Remember, this is practice. If you go outside of your lines, that's totally fine. We're getting used to working and manipulating watercolors. So I'm going to first activate the pigment in one of my watercolors. So I'm gonna dip my brush in my water and I'm going to choose a color. Let's do this blue. And I'm gonna add a little bit more water in there, and I'm going to wet this watercolor until I can see that I am able to pull enough pigment from the little reservoir onto my brush, and my brush can hold some of that blue that I chose. Feel free to choose any color while we're working on this. You don't have to match mine. In our very first box right here, we are going to do a traditional watercolor on dry paper. Okay, and you'll see that we kind of start to change the surface of our paper as we go. So I am dipping from my watercolor with a wet paintbrush with pigment on it directly onto dry paper. And I want to fill this entire little box with this blue watercolor. Don't worry about making this look like a masterpiece. If you are a perfectionist and you want to get as close to those edges and stay in the lines as you want to, be my guest. Otherwise, you are just working to get some nice rich pigment onto your first box, just like that. And I'm gonna dry or rinse off my brush a little bit because we're going to move on to the second box. Go ahead and pause this video as you work. If you need a little bit more time to kind of paint this, it's kind of nice if you watch what I'm doing, pause, do it yourself, and then continue the video. In your second box, I want you to choose a new color from your palette and get some water into that color. So activate that pigment once again. And I went with this green. And don't worry, our water is gonna start to get kind of icky, but don't worry about it. We'll just use it the whole time. All right. Before I paint onto my paper, I want to change the surface of this paper. What I'm going to ask you to do is wet your paper with just a rinsed off wet paintbrush, okay? So I'm just going right into my same water. It doesn't matter if it's kind of dirty. The purpose is to see how our new watercolor will act on the paper and how we control it when we change the surface that we're painting on. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going to just paint water all over the surface of just this rectangle. Do your best to just stay in this rectangle. We don't want our color running to other areas. All right, I'm gonna make sure I can get enough color onto my brush. And I'm using green this time. And I'm going to go right in onto that wet paper. And notice how my pigment and my watercolor play a little bit differently on the surface of the paper when it is wet versus when it was completely dry. Okay, and I just went in and grabbed a little bit more pigment. It's much more kind of washed out than that first box. Okay, and now I'm rinsing off my brush once again. Don't worry, remember you can pause the video and kind of catch up if you need to. So we went with dry paper and watercolor, then we went with wet paper and watercolor. This time we are going to do dry on dry. So this technique is referred to as dry brushing. What I need to do first is I need to choose a color to work with. I'm just gonna hop over here to this darker kind of violety blue, and I'm gonna get some water in here and I'm gonna activate that color. I'm gonna rinse off this brush, and I'm actually gonna set this brush aside because I've been working with it and because it's damp. For this box here, we're gonna do what is called dry brushing. So I wanna start with a really, really nice dry paintbrush, and I'm going to just delicately dip it into the color that I just activated. Okay, notice how you can hardly tell that I have anything on my paintbrush at all. This box is going to be experimental. Do not worry about making it look like the most beautiful thing in the world. We're going for more of a finishing technique. So when we get to our project, we'll talk about how we could use this technique. But if I go quick motions across my watercolor paper with a dry brush and very little pigment, we can kind of get a different texture happening across our paper in that little square or rectangle. I'm gonna go ahead and rinse that brush off. I'm gonna set it to the side again. And now we're coming into this fourth box, the last one on our top row. In this box, we're going to work on blending our colors. Okay, so most important thing is that you are going to work with more than one color. You can work with 2, 3, 4. It's kind of up to you. I think I'm just going to stick with 2 colors for now. We're going to use a wet paintbrush this time. So we're going back to how we painted with these two. We're not going to do dry brushing. You're going to be working with a wet paintbrush, but I want you to keep your paper kind of dry, and let's just see how this goes. So I'm gonna pull a little bit of this green, and I'm just gonna start adding some of this pigment to my paper in different areas. Okay, now I'm gonna go back into this blue that I was using before, and I'm gonna paint right along the edges of my greens. Okay, I'm gonna get a little bit more. Now what we're looking for is, are we able to kind of meld the edges or melt the edges of these colors together so that they kind of run into one another, right? The transition from one color to the next kind of becomes a little bit hard to distinguish, but we're still able to see that green, and those blues. You'll notice that every once in a while I went back into just my water and I pulled just a little bit of plain water onto the surface as well. That just allows you to move that pigment around a little bit more. And so I'm able to kind of get those nice blended areas rather than really harsh lines between my two colors. All right, fifth box here, we are going to do a gradient, okay? Your goal is to go from a really, really solid dark color, a lot of pigment, to a almost white, okay? So almost as if it becomes so transparent that we only see the paper coming through the watercolor. The trick to this is to control where we place water on our paper prior to adding any color at all. Okay, so if I want one area of my paper or one side of my rectangle to have more color, more pigment to it, I want that area to have less water. Okay, so that's the key. More pigment or more intense color, less water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a wet brush and I'm going to wet my paper again. Okay, we want a saturated surface on one end of our rectangle and an almost dry surface on the other. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start painting just water back and forth across my rectangle until I reach the bottom. Okay, you could do this from the top or from the bottom, doesn't matter. The most important thing is that I did not go back into my water because I only want a lot of water up here and I want to gradually become drier as I work my way down the paper. All right, and now I'm going to go back in my color. I want lots of pigment where my dry paper is, little bit of pigment up here. Okay, so I'm going to start where I ended. And I'm going to go lots of pigment. And I'm just going to start slowly working my way up my paper. And notice when I start to hit the really, really watery parts, my pigment blends out way nicer and kind of smoother than it was down here. And I just went over this back and forth just twice. And I know that there's a bit of a glare, but I hope that you can see our dry paper, we added pigment. So we went from our paint directly to our paper here. And we didn't go back into the paint again. We just worked our way up because we went from really, really wet paper to dry paper. So we went from lots of pigment to no pigment. I'm going to dry that brush off once more. And now we are going to get into these little household supplies. First, we're going to start out with some salt. So I hope that everybody can kind of discover some salt throughout your house somewhere. Hopefully you have just some on your kitchen table or on the counter, anything like that. Even if it's like a crank salt where it's like kind of sea salt and you have to like grind it on top of the paper, totally fine, that'll work. Just grab any type of salt that your parents or your family might have on hand. Okay, we're going to add salt on top of watercolor and watch how the salt will act as almost like a barrier to the color. Okay, wherever we put salt, it's going to create like a repelling effect between the pigment and the paper. So how do we want to go about this? First, we want to wet our paper and I want to add a lot of pigment to this paper. Okay, so I'm choosing a color. Oops, I forgot. I want to wet my paper first. Good thing I caught that. All right, so I just have some gross water on my brush. It's okay if your paper is kind of tinted. That's going to happen as we work with dirty water, so no worries. All right, now I'm going to get that color on my brush and I'm going to start adding a lot of color. So I want this pretty dark. Okay, I'm gonna maybe pull in some of this green that I've been working with. Notice that I kind of stuck with a palette as well. I didn't jump around my colors too much. I kind of stayed in these cooler colors, these greens and these blues. Feel free though, if you want to jump around your palette and you want to use warm and cool colors, be my guest. Okay. All right, so I have lots of pigment on there, and my paper is really, really saturated. So here's what we're gonna do next. You're gonna take a little bit of salt, okay, and I'm gonna take a pinch, and I'm going to drizzle it directly onto my watercolor, okay? And it might be a little bit tricky to see, but hopefully when you do this at home, you'll start to see that that salt sucked up some of that pigment, okay? Now I want you to just leave that. You're gonna let that dry completely with the salt on top of it. Once it's dry, we kind of scrape off that salt into a garbage or outside or something like that, and we'll be left with almost like a speckly effect, okay? Last but not least, we need some plastic, okay? Find some saran wrap, find a Target or Cub Foods plastic bag, find a sandwich bag. The goal of it is whatever kind of plastic you're using, you want to be able to crinkle it up kind of like this. Okay, so I didn't squish it. I didn't like kind of put it into a ball as tightly as I can. I just kind of scrunched it up a little bit. We're looking for a lot of texture going on there. Okay, a lot of sharper edges and a lot of valleys. And I'm just gonna set that to my side just for a second. In this 7th box here, we're going to add a little, you can either start with a wet paper or you could start with dry paper. It's kind of completely up to you. Both techniques will work just fine. The most important thing is that when your watercolor is still wet, that's when we want to have access to our saran wrap or plastic. Okay, so however you choose to work, just be sure that you have this plastic wrap ready and right next to you. All right, so I am going to activate a little bit of pink pigment and get that on my brush. And I'm gonna add that pigment or my watercolor directly onto my paper. You can add more than one color to this too if you would like to. I am just going to do one for the sake of this video getting to be extremely long. All right, so I have a nice wash across my paper. Rinse off my brush super, super quick. All right, I have my plastic wrap. I'm going to stamp it down onto my watercolor. Okay, I'm going to stamp it down. I'm going to press gently, but I'm not going to squish it. And I'm going to peel it off. Okay, you might not notice a ton of change immediately when I peel it off, but on your own, I want you to just kind of let it dry, let it do its thing, and you'll kind of start to see how you get a different texture on top of that watercolor versus just painting it, and a different one as well than the salt. Okay, so I'm gonna gently push this onto the surface of my paper on top of my watercolor. I'm going to peel this off and I'm going to leave it. Okay, I'm not gonna touch it. And we're just gonna let that do its thing. Let it dry, okay? Let's see what you end up with. All right, very last square. I want you to try something that you maybe should redo. If you really struggled with the gradient, maybe work on the gradient here. Okay, that's a great skill for you to learn. If you struggled with blending your colors, try that here. If you really liked working on wet paper, you felt like that was easier to control, maybe practice doing that again down here. Or maybe you just kind of want to play around. I'm gonna wet my paper. And I think I might just do like some starburst kind of things. Like maybe I just let the paint do whatever it wants. That's what I'm gonna do. All right, I'm gonna pull some more colors in here. Okay, I have a super wet brush, and I'm just grabbing some pigment and letting it do its thing. I'm gonna rinse my brush off because I did not like that color. All right, I'm gonna just drop a little bit of water on there. Ooh. All right, and I'm going to let that dry. And you'll see a final photo of my work on our slides when we discuss this. All right, you guys, please email me or call me or put a direct message to me on Schoology if you have any questions or you need any help. Otherwise, don't forget to stop by the virtual kind of help sessions Monday or Thursday afternoon for art. Otherwise, if you can complete this before next class, photograph your work, upload it onto your Schoology assignment, and you are good to go to move on to our next task prior to our first watercolor project. All right, awesome guys, I'll see you soon.